Okay, welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be about the Eastern Front during World War II. The Eastern Front during World War II is going to be where much of the fighting of the entire war is going to be done. As a matter of fact, the when Germany eventually invades the Soviet Union, this will become the largest land war in history. And so, uh, Hitler has always been eyeing Lebensraum or living room, living space, I should say, so you don't confuse it with the room in your house, in the Soviet Union. The very far western and southern parts of the Soviet Union have some pretty valuable land. The area kind of around Ukraine today, there's oil there, there's good farmland and all of these things that Hitler believes Germany really is going to need if it's going to be self sufficient, if it's going to be able to be an industrial powerhouse, and if it's going to, be able to produce enough materials to be able to maintain the territory that they've already taken over within Europe. And so on June 22nd, 1941, we're going to see that Adolf Hitler is going to violate the Soviet non-aggression pact. Excuse me. The Soviet Union and Germany had, instituted this non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Compact, whatever you want to call it. And the idea was Hitler wanted to not have to fight a two-front war while it was dealing with, France and Great Britain in the West. So he needed to be able to, have at least some reassurance that he doesn't have to worry about Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union in the East. He would have never been able to invade Poland, which is a border country between Germany and the Soviet Union, without some sort of agreement with Joseph Stalin. And so the two come to an agreement together. Stalin had agreed to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or the Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, essentially because of the purges that the Communist Party had been putting into place in the Soviet Union. Stalin killed his best military leaders because they could potentially be a threat to his government. And so he knew he wasn't prepared to be able to fight a long drawn out war. And so, he signed the non aggression pact. Well, he thought he was going to have about 10 years to be able to get new generals in place. They've got to be trained and have to get the education necessary for that. He thought he had 10 years to get his industry going again. He killed, many of the businessmen that ran the major industrial factories within the Soviet Union. And so he thought 10 years would be enough to be able to do all that. Well, Hitler is going to, strike much sooner than that. Hitler believes he can turn and face the Soviet Union now because he's already conquered France. He believes that Great Britain is so depleted that they're not going to be able to start a second front in the western part of Europe. So he wants to turn his attention to the Soviet Union, believing that if he strikes quick enough and hard enough, he's going to be able to take out the Soviet Union before they become a threat. This is where Hitler makes another gigantic error, right? Throughout the lectures, we've been talking about a couple of things that Hitler has done that has almost ensured that he's not going to have a total victory in Europe. The first was, going after Paris and not taking out the British Expeditionary Force, during the invasion of France. His biggest blunder, however, is leaving Great Britain in the fight and starting a second front in the Soviet Union. Hitler's actually probably pretty close to being right in that Great Britain's just isn't able and strong enough now. They're just too depleted to start a second front on their own. But what he hasn't calculated in yet is that if America gets involved, the fact that Great Britain is still in the fight means the island of England can become a staging ground for an American invasion. And so it's leaving essentially the back door open. The other thing that he gets wrong here is this assumption that the Soviet Union is going to, if they just get, if Germany just hits them hard enough that they'll just quit. They're not. That's not going to happen. Joseph Stalin is a strongman dictator. He's just not going to allow that to happen. And the Soviet strategy to face Blitzkrieg actually ends up being, actually, I hate to say successful, because lots of people and lots of property are going to be killed and destroyed, but it is in a sense successful because it's going to completely wear down the German Wehrmacht, or the German army. And so Hitler opens up this second front and invades essentially with three battle groups. He's going to invade into the Soviet Union with Army Group North, Army Group Central, and Army Group South. There's several different targets here. I'm going to simplify what those targets are. Hitler several times throughout this invasion is going to change his targets, and that's going to cause some problems for the German army. But the essential plan is going to be termed Operation Barbarossa. And it's going to involve first the Luftwaffe going in and attacking the Soviet Air Force. The Soviet Air Force is not much to speak of as far as modern air forces go. I don't want to downplay it. I mean, they have an air force. I mean, it's not completely useless, but the German Luftwaffe just, right off the bat is going to be able to destroy about 25% of the Soviet Air Force, and very quickly all along the Eastern Front here, we're going to see the Luftwaffe being able to control the skies. When the three army groups invade, we're going to see, that essentially, this 1,000-mile front, you can see the dotted line here. It's an extremely long front, and it's going to look like there's success for the German military, because of the first day, they're going to be able to take about 200 miles of territory. I mean, they're just going to be, racing in, snagging up parts of Russia. And that's, again, because the Soviet Union's just not prepared to fight this battle. As a matter of fact, not only have they, destroyed all the competent leaders within the upper brass of their military, they've killed all of Joseph Stalin has purposely killed all of the, qualified and experienced tank units. And so there's really not very many people in the Soviet Union that know how to operate a tank. They have lots of tanks, but they have nobody that knows how to use them. And so, the German, Panzer units, their tank units have a ton of experience and are just, the Germans are going to be able to take advantage of that. By about 2.5 months, the Germans will be reaching all the way up in the north there to Leningrad. And so we have our three army groups, the Army Group North, which is headed up to Leningrad, Army Group Central, that is heading towards the Moscow region, of eventually trying to get to Moscow. And then we have Army Group South, which is going very specifically towards the Ukraine. They're heading into the oil-rich territory. Hitler's army needs that oil if it's going to, keep operating. And so what we see is, as some, early success by the German Wehrmacht is going to be stalled after the German military reaches Leningrad. Leningrad is going to be one of the major battles of the Eastern Front. Army Group North is going to be able to get to Leningrad very quickly. They're going to surround Leningrad and start to lay siege to Leningrad. And so what ends up happening is that the Russian strategy is really starting to take effect by this point. And you might ask, what's the Russian strategy? Well, it's essentially, first and foremost, it's to use their geography to their advantage. And so the Soviet Union is massive. It's just absolutely geographically massive. And so the idea is to essentially, just to dumb it down, I guess, is to retreat. And so as the Germans are invading, the Soviets are just retreating further and further east. And as they go, they're taking with them anything of value. The Soviet Union will pick up entire industrial centers of cities and start to move them further and further east. Anything that they can't take with them, they're going to destroy so the Germans can't use it. And so factories and factory equipments that can't be taken to the east, they're all going to be destroyed. Farmland is going to be set on fire, and crops that can't be carried east are going to be destroyed as well. And so this is going to have a really serious effect on the Germans later. It's not like an instantaneous kind of thing. This is a long-term strategy. And so as the Germans are moving further and further east, their supply lines are getting longer and longer and longer, and it's getting more and more difficult for Germans to get the war materials they need to their soldiers. The German army's been so successful up until this point that they just assumed that this was, they were going to relatively easily conquer Soviet territory, use the Soviet resources against the Soviet people, and that very quickly they would be in Moscow, and the war would be over. Well, that's not going to happen, and the war is going to take longer than the Germans expected. And now they don't have food, and they don't have the equipment that they're going to need for the Russian winters. And the Russian winters are absolutely horrible. Ask Napoleon. Many armies have broken their back. Because of the Soviet winters. And so the Soviet Union is, retreating out, but there is still going to be millions of people in Leningrad. The city will be surrounded. Leningrad is symbolically significant. It's really not, because all the valuable stuff has been moved out of Leningrad. It's not strategically that important anymore. But because Lenin was the one that brought communism to the Soviet Union, and because Hitler hates communism, Hitler getting a victory here would be symbolically significant. And so he really wants the city. On the other side of that coin, Joseph Stalin can't let the father of Soviet communism's city fall into the hands of fascists. And so, Lenin's got to hold on to the city as long as he can. He really needs to hold on to it forever. And so the Germans surround the city and start to bombard it with artillery, with bombings from the Luftwaffe. But the city's going to hold on. About 3 million people get trapped inside the city, and as the siege goes on, these people start to starve, and we're going to see an example of just one of many examples of Soviet just stubbornness and bravery. The people of the Soviet Union just are just refusing to give in and to surrender. And so one of the great miracles of World War II is going to happen in Leningrad. And that's going to end up being the road of life. So what ends up happening is we have a 900-day siege of the city, and so the people are running out of food. And there's a lake located right next to the city, Lake Ladoga, and as the lake freezes, because the Germans have surrounded the city except for the lake, as the lake freezes in the wintertime, we start to see Soviet citizens walking across the lake to the interior of the Soviet Union to get supplies. First, they're, when the lake first freezes, they're walking or snow skiing across the lake. As it freezes more, we're going to see, like you see in the picture on the right here, donkeys carrying food into the city, food and supplies into the city to continue to resist the Germans. And then eventually, as we get the deep winter, because it gets so freaking cold in the Soviet Union, we're going to start to see trucks start to drive across this lake. Now, this is amazing because Germany has an air force. They're strafing this lake as they're trying to, the Soviets are trying to bring supplies across the lake. And so, that's a very frozen lake. And two, it's incredibly brave of these people to be able to do this. And because of this, what we're going to see is, the city is going to be able to survive. 640,000 civilians are going to die during this time. They're mostly through starvation and disease like dysentery. But the city's going to be able to hold on, and it holds on much longer than what Hitler thinks that it can hold on for, which is important because it's keeping Hitler's forces divided. They're fighting in a frozen, conditions that they're not prepared to fight in, and they're not winning. And so far, throughout these lectures, we haven't really been talking about a whole lot of losses on the German side. A lot of these German soldiers and German civilians really believe that they're invincible and that Hitler can win anything. And so the fact that we're essentially ending in a tie in Leningrad is going to be very significant. Oh, I'm sorry. And it's going to start to break the myth that the German Wehrmacht is invincible. And so by the end of the siege of Leningrad, we're going to see, no real German victory here. And so what will end up happening is that the Germans are going to turn their attention elsewhere. And so they will be turning their attention to Stalingrad. Stalingrad is going to be considered by most people and most historians as the real turning point of World War II. I think that's really kind of significant here because, we haven't, by this point, we haven't really talked about much American involvement here. It's true as Americans, we really like to believe that, we came in, we stormed the beaches of Normandy, which is not, in fact, the first thing that American soldiers did in this war. But then, it was, Dwight Eisenhower who stormed the beaches of Normandy, and then General Patton who, raced into Germany, liberating the Europeans, and that eventually, Hitler commits suicide and America won World War II. Now, I would argue that it would be almost impossible for the Allies to win without American involvement. It's mostly our wartime production that is going to turn the tide. America is just going to produce more war materials than essentially the rest of the world combined. That industrial output in America is just obscene. But what really wears out the German army happens in the Soviet Union, and it's going to happen at Stalingrad. It's the German Sixth Army that is tasked with taking Stalingrad. Stalingrad, is considered by the Soviet army to be the Soviets in general to be the greatest battle of this war. It's where Stalin is really going to make a stand. He's going to order his soldiers to hold the city at all costs. Hitler will eventually end up telling his Sixth Army to do the same. And so the two are really going to go toe to toe in Stalingrad. The taking Stalingrad is important for a couple of reasons. It's the pathway into the South and some of the most useful land in what would be Western Russia. This is the area that Hitler talks about as his Lebensraum, and to Stalin knows that he needs this land for a multitude of reasons. One is for resources, but two, if he was willing to fight tooth and nail and not give up in Leningrad because of its symbolic significance, what do you expect him to do for the city that has his name attached to it? Of course, he's going to hold on at all cost in Stalingrad. And so as the Germans start to take the city, we really kind of see modern warfare taking place. The Germans will surround the city. The city is actually located on the Volga River. This is a strategically important river. You control the river. You can control supplies that run down the river. but it's also, access to the eastern part of the Soviet Union. And so the Germans essentially, if the river is running, let's go here, the city's on this side of the river, what the Germans do is they surround the city here, and with the Soviets back to the river. Now, this is going to be pretty significant because it's at this point that the Germans start to slowly, kind of street by street, block by block, start to push in on this into the Soviet territory, and the Soviets are falling further and further back. But the Soviets are able to actually get supplied because the Germans don't control the other side of the Volga River, and so at great cost into human life and war material, the Soviets are shipping supplies to their surrounded comrades across the Volga River. The Germans are contesting that, but they're able to do it. It's going to be important later. And so the Soviets get pushed back essentially all the way to the river. And that's when the Soviets kind of flip the script on the Nazis. They start to use blitzkrieg tactics to defeat the Germans, because as the Germans have them surrounded, the Soviets realize, well, let's just turn the Nazi strategy against them. And, blitzkrieg from previous lectures, we know you attack the sides where the enemy is the weakest, and then push out and then pincer around them and surround your enemy that way. And that's exactly what the Soviets are going to do. They're going to break through the German lines at the sides and then surround the German soldiers. And then as they surround the German soldiers, they're essentially going to be in a position to completely cut off the supply for the German Sixth Army. This is called Operation Uranus. And it's going to be very successful. That's important because the German Sixth Army are some of the best trained, best equipped, most experienced troops that Hitler has. And so when the German Army, Sixth Army gets surrounded, Hitler just says, no way. No way this is going to happen. You cannot surrender. He orders the German Sixth Army to hang on. And he essentially, he believes in the core of who he is that the Aryan people are superior to the Slavic Soviets. And so, he really believes that the Slavs are just, a step above animals, and that the Aryans, if they just hold on, if they fight long enough, they're going to be able to survive this. Well, the German Sixth is surrounded in a way that the Soviets weren't. The Soviets had access to the other side of the Volga River. The Germans don't have that. They're completely surrounded. So essentially nothing is getting in. Now, the German Luftwaffe is going to try to airdrop supplies into the German Sixth, but they're just not capable of doing that. The Stalingrad is too far away from, the main German military bases, and the Luftwaffe, because of the Battle of Britain, just is not in a position to fly enough flights to drop in enough supplies for the German Sixth. Winter has hit hard. Many of these German soldiers just don't have the equipment necessary to fight during the winter. I mean, some of them, because the Holocaust is happening within, Europe. A lot of, Jewish old ladies' mink coats are being taken from them before they're being gassed in the gas chambers. We're seeing some of the German soldiers are wearing, these old ladies' fur coats, just doing whatever they can to survive. It's just not going to be enough. The Soviets really quickly start to run out of food, and then because the ground is, so tough and so frozen over, it's really hard to bury the bodies. What you see is a picture above is, a dead frozen body from the siege of Stalingrad. And because you can't bury the dead, you're going to start to have problems where these bodies are rotting, and as they rot, all of that is kind of seeping into the water supply, and it's getting people sick. And the German Sixth starts to get dysentery or diarrhea. And so when you're in that kind of situation, your military doesn't have enough food and doesn't have enough water, and all of a sudden you get diarrhea. The German sixth just is in a position where they physically are not strong enough to be able to fight. And so the commander of the German sixth is going to surrender. And when he surrenders, that is a devastating blow to the German military. And so, it's against Hitler's orders that these soldiers surrender. They will surrender. They're going to go to Soviet prison camps. And believe me, Soviet prison camps are, no summer camp. Most of these soldiers are going to end up dying in those camps. They're absolutely brutal. If you ever want to know what a Soviet or a communist Soviet camp is like, I challenge you to read The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It's those camps are just absolutely devastating. And so these soldiers are going to be taken off the battlefield and significantly weaken the German military. By the way, we have somewhere in Leningrad, the low estimates of 680 to, about 1 million civilians dying there. The Soviets didn't keep great records of that. We're going to have somewhere around 1 million to 1.5 million civilians dying in Stalingrad. So the death toll is certainly rising on the Eastern Front. Now, after Stalingrad, so the losses super high. We're going to have 140,000 dead German soldiers, 91,000 taken prisoner. And remember, the Soviet Union has significantly more people than what the Germans have. And so the Germans losing, 200,000 plus soldiers is not sustainable losses for the German military. About 500,000 Russians soldiers are going to have to die to be able to hold on to Stalingrad. So you see, the German military is, in fact, better equipped. They've, generally used better strategies, but the Russians, they're going to be able to throw way more people into the meat grinder. And because of that, the Germans just can't stand against it. All right. So Stalingrad ends up becoming the real turning point of World War II. It's not going to be the last time that Hitler goes on the offensive, but it's the point where the writing should be on the wall that there's going to be an eventual German defeat. Now, anything can happen. We're still not to the Battle of the Bulge yet, which is going to be, the last, Nazi offensive. But we're getting close to that. We're absolutely getting close to that. So the next big battle on the Eastern Front is going to be at Kursk. This is referred to as Operation Citadel. And so what Hitler's plan is here is to essentially throw everything he has got at the Soviets and try and turn around the losses on the Eastern Front. And so what he's going to do is he's going to start to pull together as much of his mechanized units as possible. He's going to be pulling out of Northern Africa. We'll be talking about that in a future lecture. And so he's going to be pulling out of, the battles in Northern Africa and, pulling resources out of Italy and dumping them all in Kursk. One of the problems with that is, though, that to be able, he just wants to build the most gigantic hammer on the planet and smash the Soviets. Well, the problem is that takes time. And because all of that takes time, he's giving the Soviets time to be able to dig in, defensively. And the Soviets are actually going to do that really well. They're going to build all kinds of anti-tank defenses, all kinds of mines, and they're going to start to pull in their own resources as well. And so this will end up becoming Hitler's last gigantic offensive in the East. There'll be some smaller battles, but nothing quite to this level. 1/3 of all of Germany's military strength is going to be put into this battle. And so if, the Germany in Stalingrad loses, some of their best soldiers. Germany at Kursk is going to end up losing a lot of their equipment. And so what the Soviets are doing, and what they don't get a lot of credit for in the history books, is they're softening up the Germans. It's going to become at huge losses for the Soviet Union. The fact that they're still a little bit, I should say, still a little bit angry at the West for not admitting. But it's going to be these Soviet losses and these Soviet battles that are going to really soften up the Germans, later for the British and the Americans to open up a second front on the West, a second front, which, by the way, Stalin is begging for, right? I mean, he's really the only one fighting Hitler right now, and Hitler is able to focus pretty much all of his attention on the Soviet Union. There's some stuff going on in Africa at this point, but that's nothing near the scale of what's happening on the Eastern Front. And so Joseph Stalin is turning to Great Britain and America and saying, help, please, please help alleviate the pressure. And if you open up a second front, Hitler has to divide his forces. It's going to be easier on the Soviet Union. And America and Great Britain, mostly because Great Britain and their leader, Winston Churchill, don't believe that Hitler has been softened up enough yet, are not going to be opening up that second front to help Stalin. Stalin thinks that's a ploy. Stalin really believes, and he's going to believe it his whole life, that what Great Britain and America really want is for the fascists in Germany to fight the Soviets, communist Soviets in Russia, to fight to the death, and then whichever one ends up being victorious will be so weak that the capitalist democracies can then just overrun them. And so Stalin really believes that. There's no evidence to suggest that that's what the real plan is. I'm sure some people in power were thinking it and were thinking, well, that wouldn't be such a bad thing. But no real evidence to suggest that that's the actual plan. So anyway, Battle of Kursk is going to happen, but because the Soviets were able to properly defend the Kursk region with all kinds of artillery, they're going to bring in their air force and all the tanks that they have. The Soviets are going to be able to actually get a very impressive amount of supplies out to Kursk. Now, keep in mind, these are 5-year plan tanks. And so some of them don't work the way they're supposed to work. It's government planning. So, it's not going to be as quality material. And because of the purges, where they're not going to have, very experienced soldiers operating that stuff. But it will be enough to hold the Germans off. And so the Germans have, just under 1 million soldiers in the region, 10,000 artillery guns, 2,700 tanks, 2,000 aircraft. The Russians will field 1.3 million soldiers, 20,000 artillery pieces, 3,600 tanks, and 2,400 planes. And so they're able to get enough people and material into the field to be able to hold the Germans back. The Germans will be forced to retreat, which will be a gigantic victory for the Soviets. And it's going to be at this point that the Soviets are going to start to continually push further and further west. Hitler is going to be on the retreat from this point forward. Morale among German soldiers is really starting to fall. This idea of the invincible German army is being disproven. It's been shattered at this point. The Eastern Front is now referred to as, they're actually used as threats within the German military. And so if you're on the Western Front or have some cushy job and you upset your superiors, they'll threaten to send you to the Eastern Front, which is considered by many to be a death sentence. And so, things aren't looking well for Hitler on the Eastern Front. All right, that, my friends, today concludes our lecture on the Eastern Front of World War II. Thank you very much, and I will see you shortly.